The morning the sprinklers went off, Karen was already halfway across my lawn. She didn't see it coming. Within seconds, she was drenched, screaming, slipping in the mud while her dog went ballistic. Her white heels sank into the grass. Her designer sunglasses flew off her face. And the entire neighborhood saw it happen. From my porch, coffee in hand, I just stood there. Because this wasn't some accident. This was deliberate. You see, Karen wasn't just my neighbor. She was the head of our HOA. And for months, she'd been cutting across my property like she owned it. I asked her to stop. I warned her. I even reported it. She laughed in my face. So I built a trap. And when it finally went off, it didn't just humiliate her. It started a chain reaction that destroyed everything she spent years building. What she didn't realize that morning was simple. I wasn't just defending my lawn anymore. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. I moved into Maplewood Estates 3 years ago. Quiet street. Clean sidewalks. The kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other and nobody really causes problems. At least, that's what I thought. Karen lived 4 houses down. She was impossible to miss. President of the HOA. Always dressed like she was heading to brunch at a country club. Pearl necklaces. Crisp blazers. The kind of person who smiled at you but never with her eyes. And from day one, she made sure everyone knew who ran things. I didn't care. I kept my lawn trimmed. I followed the rules. I paid my dues on time. I wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble found me anyway. It started small. I'd notice her walking her little white dog every morning around 7. Same route. Same time. Except she wasn't using the sidewalk. She was cutting straight across my front lawn. Corner to corner. A direct line from her driveway to the main street. The first time, I figured it was a one-off. Maybe she was in a hurry. The second time, I thought maybe she didn't realize. But by the end of the first week, it was a pattern. Every single morning. Her heels leaving little divots in the grass. Her dog stopping to sniff, sometimes worse. I didn't want to make it a big deal. So one morning, I stepped outside while she was mid-crossing. I smiled. Kept it friendly. I mentioned that I'd noticed her cutting through and asked if she wouldn't mind using the sidewalk instead. My lawn was starting to show wear. Nothing aggressive. Just a neighbor asking another neighbor for a little respect. She looked at me like I'd just asked her to solve a math equation. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A dismissive one. She told me the neighborhood was a community. That we all share the space. That I shouldn't be so territorial over a little grass. Then she walked off, her dog trotting behind her. I stood there, coffee in hand, confused. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The next morning, she did it again. Same route. Same time. I watched from the window. She didn't even glance toward my house. So I put up a small sign. Nothing dramatic. Just a polite little yard marker that said, "Please use sidewalk, private property." I thought that would be clear enough. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA. Printed on official letterhead. Signed by Karen herself. The letter informed me that my sign violated community aesthetics guidelines. Unauthorized yard signage was prohibited under Section 4.7 of the HOA bylaws. I had 7 days to remove it, or I'd be fined $50. I read it 3 times. She reported me for putting up a sign on my own lawn to stop her from walking across it. I pulled out my HOA handbook that night, flipped through the bylaws, found Section 4.7. It mentioned decorative signs, political signs, sale signs. Nothing about a simple pathway request. The rule was vague enough that she could twist it however she wanted. But I didn't want to fight. So I took the sign down. I figured that was it. She made her point. I made mine. We'd both move on. I was wrong. The very next morning, she crossed my lawn again. This time, she looked right at my front window as she did it. I saw her smile. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about convenience. This wasn't about a shortcut. This was about power. She wanted me to know that she could do whatever she wanted. And that I couldn't stop her. I started keeping a log. Dates. Photos from my window. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but I wanted a record. Just in case. A week later, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. I kept it professional. I outlined the issue. I referenced the handbook section on property boundaries and resident respect. I attached photos showing the trail forming across my grass. I submitted it through the proper channels. I waited for a response. 3 days later, I got one. It was another letter. Same letterhead. Same signature. The HOA board had reviewed my complaint. They determined that sidewalk usage was a personal choice and not enforceable under current community guidelines. They suggested I consider neighborhood harmony before submitting further complaints. They reminded me that frivolous reports could result in administrative fees. I read that letter twice. She didn't just dismiss my complaint. She threatened me for making it. I sat on my porch that evening, watching her walk across my lawn again. She didn't hurry. She didn't look guilty. She walked like she owned the place. And technically, in a way, she did. That night, I made a decision. If the rules wouldn't protect me, I'd have to protect myself. I just didn't know yet how far I'd have to go. I started documenting everything. Every time Karen crossed my lawn, I took a photo. I noted the time, the date, the weather. I kept a spreadsheet. I thought if I had enough evidence, someone would have to listen. I was naive. 2 weeks later, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't about a sign. It was about my grass height. According to the HOA, my lawn exceeded the maximum allowable length by ½ inch. I had 5 days to mow it or face a $75 fine. I had mowed it 3 days earlier. I went outside and measured it myself. 2¼ inches. The bylaws stated maximum height of 3 inches. I was well within the limit. I took photos. I measured multiple spots. I documented everything and sent a response to the board. Karen replied personally. She said the measurement was taken at the side yard, near the fence line, where shaded grass tends to grow unevenly. She said the rules applied to all sections of the property, not just the front. She attached a photo. It was blurry, angled weird. I couldn't even tell if it was my yard. But the fine stood. I paid it. I didn't have a choice. Unpaid fines accumulated interest. After 90 days, they could place a lien on your property. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The next week, I got a notice about my trash bins. Apparently, I'd left them visible from the street past noon on a non-collection day. Another $50 fine. I checked my phone. I'd brought the bins in at 10:47 a.m. I had a timestamp from my doorbell camera. I sent the footage to the board. Karen responded that the timestamp couldn't be verified and that the violation had been confirmed by a board member during a neighborhood walkthrough. I asked which board member. She said that information was confidential. I paid the fine. Then it was my mailbox. The paint was chipping. Then it was a garden hose I'd left coiled near my garage. Then it was a holiday decoration I'd put up 2 days too early according to the seasonal display guidelines. Every week, something new. I wasn't the only one noticing. My neighbor, Steve, mentioned he'd seen Karen walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking notes. He joked that she was looking for things to write people up for. He wasn't joking for long. 2 weeks later, Steve got hit with a fine for parking his truck in his own driveway. Apparently, trucks over a certain weight classification violated the aesthetic vehicle standards. He'd lived there for 6 years. He'd always parked that truck there. But now, suddenly, it was a problem. I started asking around. Turns out, I wasn't alone. At least 4 other people had been fined in the past 2 months. All for small things. All things that had never been enforced before. And all of them had one thing in common. They'd either complained about Karen or questioned an HOA decision. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was retaliation. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was open to all residents. I figured if I addressed the board directly, in front of everyone, maybe I'd get somewhere. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. About 20 people showed up. Karen sat at the head table with 3 other board members. She smiled at everyone as they walked in. When it came time for resident comments, I stood up. I kept it calm. I explained the pattern of fines. I mentioned the lawn crossing issue. I suggested that enforcement seemed inconsistent and potentially targeted. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked for transparency. Karen listened with her hands folded. When I finished, she thanked me for my input. Then she said that all enforcement actions were conducted in accordance with the bylaws and that any resident who felt unfairly targeted was welcome to submit a formal appeal in writing. I'd already done that. Twice. She knew that. One of the other board members, an older man named Phil, spoke up. He said he'd noticed the increase in violations too and wondered if maybe the board should review the enforcement process. Karen cut him off. She reminded him that the board had voted to increase neighborhood standards 6 months ago and that consistent enforcement was part of that initiative. Phil didn't say anything after that. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. As I was leaving, Karen stopped me near the door. She smiled. That same cold smile. She told me she appreciated residents who were passionate about the community. Then she said that if I continued to have concerns, I should consider running for the board myself during the next election cycle. Her tone made it clear that wasn't a genuine suggestion. It was a warning. I went home that night feeling trapped. Every time I pushed back, she pushed harder. Every time I followed the rules, she found new ones to enforce. I couldn't sell. The market was bad, and I'd barely built any equity. I couldn't ignore her. The fines were adding up. And I couldn't fight her, because she controlled the only system that mattered. I sat on my porch, watching her walk across my lawn the next morning, and I realized something. She wasn't going to stop. Not unless I made her. I started researching. HOA bylaws. Property law. Easements. Boundaries. I spent hours reading through county records, old surveys, and community covenants. And that's when I found it. A small clause. Buried in the original neighborhood plat from 1987. It outlined the exact boundaries of common area versus private property. And according to that document, the path Karen had been using cut directly through my deeded lot line. She wasn't just being rude. She was trespassing. I printed the document. I highlighted the section. I took it to a real estate attorney. He confirmed it. The path she was using was entirely on my property. The HOA had no jurisdiction over it. I had legal standing. I sent a certified letter to Karen. Polite. Professional. I referenced the plat. I requested she cease using my property as a walkway. I gave her 7 days to respond. She didn't respond at all. Instead, 3 days later, I got another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a notice of a special hearing. The board was alleging that I had made threatening communications toward an HOA officer and that my behavior was creating a hostile environment. They were considering revoking my voting rights and potentially pursuing further action. I read that letter 4 times. I'd sent a legal notice about my property, and she'd turned it into a threat. That's when I realized she wasn't just abusing power. She was playing a game I didn't even know the rules to. And she was winning. But I'd learned something too. If she wanted to escalate, I'd escalate. I just needed the right moment. And as it turned out, that moment was coming sooner than I thought. The special hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. 7 p.m. same clubhouse. I was given 48 hours notice. I spent those 2 days preparing. I printed every photo, every email, every fine notice. I organized them chronologically. I rehearsed what I'd say. I wasn't going in there blind. But I also wasn't going in there alone. I invited Steve. I invited 2 other neighbors who'd been hit with fines. I told them what was happening. I asked them to witness it. They all showed up. When I walked into that meeting, Karen's face tightened. She hadn't expected an audience. The board sat at the front table. Karen in the center. Phil to her left. 2 other members I barely knew on the right. There were maybe a dozen residents scattered in chairs. Karen called the meeting to order. She read from a prepared statement. She claimed I had sent harassing correspondence. That I had made unfounded accusations against her character. That my behavior was disruptive to community harmony. She recommended a formal reprimand and suspension of my voting privileges for 6 months. Then she asked if I had anything to say. I stood up. I stayed calm. I pulled out the original plat document. I explained that my letter wasn't a threat. It was a legal notice. I walked them through the property boundaries. I showed them the highlighted section that proved the path Karen used every morning was on my private property. I said I had every right to ask her to stop. Karen didn't even blink. She said the plat was outdated, that the neighborhood had been replatted in 2003 when the HOA was formally incorporated, that the new boundaries were on file with the county. I asked to see them. She said they were available upon request through the proper channels. I asked why she hadn't mentioned them in any of her previous responses. She said it wasn't her responsibility to educate me on basic property records. Phil shifted in his seat. I could tell he wasn't comfortable, but he didn't say anything. That's when I played my next card. I pulled out my phone. I opened the folder with time-stamped doorbell footage. I showed the board a compilation I'd made. Karen crossing my lawn. Every morning. For 3 months straight. I pointed out the dates. I pointed out that several of those days corresponded with fines I'd received for unrelated violations. I suggested the pattern was hard to ignore. Karen's jaw tightened. She said that her walking route had nothing to do with HOA enforcement, that violations were reported by multiple board members and residents, that I was grasping at straws. I asked her to name one other board member who'd reported me. She refused. One of the other neighbors, a woman named Lisa, stood up. She said she'd been fined twice in the last month. Once for a garden gnome. Once for wind chimes. She'd lived there for 8 years. She'd always had those things. Steve stood up next. He mentioned his truck. He mentioned that he'd asked for clarification on the vehicle policy and had been told to submit a formal inquiry, which he did, and never got a response. Another man raised his hand. He said he'd been fined for leaving his garage door open during the day while he was working inside. The room started to shift. Karen tried to regain control. She said that increased enforcement was part of maintaining property values, that the board took their responsibilities seriously, that personal grievances shouldn't interfere with governance. But her voice had an edge now. I could see it. She was losing the room. That's when I made my final move. I told the board I'd filed a formal complaint with the county about the property boundary dispute. I said I'd requested a survey. I said that if the replat Karen mentioned actually existed, the county would have it on record. I said I'd know within a week. Karen's expression didn't change, but her hands gripped the edge of the table. She said the meeting was getting off track. She said we were here to discuss my conduct, not hers. Phil finally spoke up. He said maybe the board should table the reprimand until the boundary issue was resolved. Karen turned to him sharply. She said the two issues were unrelated. Phil said they seemed pretty related to him. The other two board members exchanged glances. One of them nodded. Karen realized she didn't have the votes. She called for a recess. The meeting never resumed. 3 days later, the county sent me the results. There was no replat. The original 1987 boundaries were still active. Karen had lied. I sent the survey report to every member of the board. I sent it to the property management company. I sent it certified mail to Karen herself. Then I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I adjusted my sprinkler system. I reprogrammed the timers. I repositioned the heads. I set them to go off every morning at 7:03 a.m. Right along the property line. Right along the path Karen used. I didn't tell her. I didn't warn her. I just waited. The next morning, I sat on my porch with my coffee. At 7:02, Karen appeared at the end of her driveway. Same route. Same confident stride. At 7:03, the sprinklers kicked on. She didn't see them until she was already in range. The water hit her from 3 directions. High pressure. She screamed. Her dog yelped and bolted. She slipped in the mud that had formed overnight from the previous watering cycle. Her white heels sank into the grass. Her designer sunglasses flew off. She fell forward, catching herself with both hands in the wet dirt. I didn't move. Just watched. She scrambled to her feet, soaked, covered in mud, and furious. She looked directly at me. She screamed my name. She said I'd pay for this. She said she'd have me fined. She said she'd take me to court. I took a sip of my coffee. Then I said, very calmly, that she was trespassing on my private property, that I'd asked her repeatedly to stop, that I had legal documentation proving it, and that if she continued, I'd file harassment charges. She stood there, dripping, shaking with rage. Then she turned and walked away. But this wasn't over, because what she did next made everything worse. For her, Karen filed a countercomplaint the same day. She claimed I had created a hazardous condition on my property, that the sprinklers were deliberately designed to cause harm, that I had humiliated her in public and damaged her personal property. She demanded I reimburse her for her ruined shoes, her sunglasses, and dry cleaning costs. She also demanded the HOA fine me for improper irrigation scheduling. I didn't respond to her directly. Instead, I forwarded everything to my attorney, along with the survey, the certified letter, the doorbell footage, and a detailed timeline of every fine, every violation notice, and every complaint I'd filed that had been ignored. He sent a formal response on my behalf. It was 3 pages long. It outlined that Karen had repeatedly trespassed on my property despite multiple requests to stop, that I had every legal right to water my own lawn on my own schedule, that her presence on my property at the time of the incident was unlawful, and that if she pursued legal action, we would counterclaim for harassment, abuse of HOA authority, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also sent a copy to the HOA board and the property management company. Karen never filed. 2 weeks later, Phil called me. He said the board had scheduled a special executive session to review Karen's conduct. He said several residents had come forward with their own complaints after the hearing. He said the property management company was concerned about liability. He asked if I'd be willing to attend and present my case. I said I would. The session was closed to the public, but I was allowed to bring my documentation. I walked them through everything: the fines, the retaliation, the false claims about the replet, the pattern of targeting. I kept it factual. I kept it calm. One of the other board members, a woman named Diane, asked Karen directly if she'd verified the replat before citing it in the hearing. Karen said she'd relied on information provided during her onboarding as president. Diane asked who provided it. Karen didn't answer. Phil asked if she'd reviewed the survey I'd submitted. She said she had. He asked if she still believed the path was on common property. She said the boundaries were unclear and that the issue required further legal review. Phil said the survey was pretty clear. The room went quiet. Diane motioned to remove Karen from her position as HOA president, effective immediately, pending a full review of enforcement practices during her tenure. The motion passed. 3-1. Karen voted against it. She was allowed to remain on the board as a non-officer member, but she lost all enforcement authority. She didn't show up to another meeting after that. In the months that followed, the new board president, Diane, launched a review of every fine issued in the past year. They found over 30 violations that had been selectively enforced or based on misinterpretations of the bylaws. 12 residents received refunds. I was one of them. The board also updated the enforcement process. Violations now required photo evidence, written warnings, and approval from at least 2 board members before a fine could be issued. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Steve got his truck situation resolved. Lisa's wind chime stayed up. The neighborhood felt a little less like a police state. Karen stopped using my lawn as a shortcut. In fact, she stopped walking her dog in the mornings altogether. I'd see her occasionally, getting into her car or checking her mail. She never looked at me, never waved, never acknowledged me at all. I didn't care. About 6 months later, I heard from Phil that Karen had quietly resigned from the board. No announcement, no farewell, just a 1-line email to the property management company. She moved out of the neighborhood 4 months after that. I don't know where she went. I didn't ask. But the house sold fast. And the new owners seemed nice. Looking back, I don't think Karen ever believed she was doing anything wrong. I think she genuinely saw herself as someone maintaining standards, protecting property values, keeping the neighborhood in line. But somewhere along the way, the rules stopped being about the community. They became about control. And when you use rules as weapons, eventually, someone's going to fight back. I didn't set out to humiliate her. I didn't want to destroy her reputation or force her out of the neighborhood. I just wanted her to stop walking across my lawn. But she couldn't let it go. She had to win. She had to prove she was in charge. And in the end, that's exactly what cost her everything. I still live in that house. I still mow my lawn every week. I still pay my HOA dues on time. And every morning at 7:03 a.m., my sprinklers still go off. Not because I'm trying to make a point, but because it's my property, and I get to decide what happens on it. The funny thing is, the neighborhood's actually quieter now. People are friendlier. There's less tension, less fear of stepping out of line. It's almost like when you stop letting one person run everything, the community actually gets a chance to breathe. I've thought a lot about what happened, about whether I went too far, about whether there was another way. And honestly, I don't know. Maybe I should have just let it go. Maybe I should have moved. Maybe I should have kept my head down and paid the fines and accepted that some battles aren't worth fighting. But I didn't. Because at some point, you have to ask yourself, how much are you willing to give up just to keep the peace? How many small humiliations do you accept before you finally say enough? And when someone with a little bit of power decides you don't matter, what do? I don't have all the answers. But I know this. Karen thought the rules would protect her. She thought her title, her authority, her position on that board made her untouchable. She thought wrong. And if it could happen to her, in a quiet neighborhood with clean sidewalks and friendly waves, it could happen anywhere. So if you're in an HOA, or you're thinking about joining one, just remember this. The people who write the rules aren't always the ones who follow them. And the person with the clipboard might not be protecting the community. They might just be protecting their own power. Keep your documents. Keep your receipts. And never assume that just because someone smiles at you, they're on your side. Because sometimes, the biggest battles are fought over the smallest things. And sometimes, a lawn is never just a lawn.